is the Banner Ravens podcast. Paul Mancano and Jonas Shaffer live on Election Day, a Tuesday in November. It's also the NFL trade deadline. Just passed mere 43 minutes ago. Jonas and I are going to discuss the move that the Ravens made today to bolster their secondary, and we will preview Thursday's game against the Cincinnati Bengals. But first, the Banner Ravens podcast is brought to you by Toyota. Toyota has been building a legacy of excellence for years. From developing hybrid technology to upping the standards of safety and efficiency, Toyota is always innovating, always making progress. And with a superior lineup of in-stock SUVs, including the adventure-ready RAV4 and capable, affordable Corolla Cross, you can experience the legacy of Toyota for yourself. Visit buyatoyota.com, the official website for deals, to find out more. Toyota, let's go places. All right, Jonas, our word of the day, underwhelming. It is defined as failing to make a positive impact or impression. Disappointing. Language of origin, Middle English is where whelm comes from. Overwhelm and its rare synonym whelm have both been around since the Middle Ages, but underwhelm is a 20th century coinage. So look at that. It's somewhat of a recent word, Jonas. Why are we underwhelmed today?
You're the host, Paul. Tell us.
Well, I'll tell you why I'm underwhelmed, Jonas. It's because the Ravens, they did make a move today. They traded for Tre'Davious White, the veteran cornerback from the Los Angeles Rams. But on a day when we expected the Ravens and perhaps hoped the Ravens would go out and bolster their defense with a significant pass rusher or an impact defensive back, they get a guy who has only played 4 games this season, a guy who has not been an above-average player in several years, was a 2019-2020 Pro Bowler in Buffalo, signed a 1-year, $10 million deal with the Rams in March, but hasn't played since the end of September as his agent has looked for a better situation. Played 98% of the snaps in the first 4 games of the season, and then he's been a healthy scratch 3 games in a row. So, Jonas, tell us about Tre'Davious White. Is he in any way somebody who can move the needle on this defense, or is he simply another body?
Oh, man. You talking about needles moving on Election Day has me triggered, Paul. I'm not going to lie. Very sensitive subject right about now. On its face, no. I mean, you got him for a song, so I think the expectations should be tempered quite significantly. You know, he hasn't really played a whole lot for a bad Rams defense. You know, I think the promise that the Rams have shown has been up front. So the fact that he hasn't been able to be more than healthy scratch in that secondary is a little bit disappointing. He obviously has that pedigree. That's something that Eric DeCosta has invested in, I think, time and time again. I mean, I say this half seriously. Like, I wonder if there's a team with more first-round draft picks on its roster than the Ravens right now. I mean, there was a lot of talk, Odell and Laquan Treadwell, I believe, in that receiving core, and people were talking about how they were like 4 or 5 first-round picks out wide, and now you have Marlon Humphrey, a former first-rounder. You have Nate Wiggins, obviously a first-rounder. Kyle Hamilton, first-rounder. Trey White, a former first-rounder. So there are worse bets than betting on a guy who not super long ago was one of the best at his spot in the league. But then the injury, the Achilles injury, the just the fact that he's stepping into this system that has not really been, super comforting to guys who have already been who were in this system last year and have struggled to find their landmarks, do their job, do their 111th. It feels like there's a pretty steep hill for him getting onto the field and being an impact player. And you combine all that with the fact that he has been strictly, for the most part, an outside cornerback in the NFL. Not a lot of, not like any safety snaps, very few slot snaps. So the hope maybe, or the wish casting that he could be a guy who could maybe fill some spots in times of need seems a little bit overdone, but who knows? Obviously it hasn't been a great couple weeks for Brandon Stevens, who's now, near the bottom in the PFF rankings. I think still he could be a really, really useful player for the Ravens. And I think that, this is not like a sign that the Ravens are going to, as soon as like a couple weeks from now, replace Brandon Stevens with Trey White. I still think, Jalen Armour-Davis at this point would probably be a better option than Trey White. But who knows? Maybe a change of scenery is what he needs. But at this point, I think all you can say is just that the compensation suggests that there was very, very little interest league-wide in this guy.
Yeah, the compensation is a 7th-round pick, and the Ravens are getting back a 7th-round pick in return. They're getting back a 2016 or 2027, I should say. I'm thinking about the election. 2027 7th-round pick, and they're trading a 2026 7th-round pick. So it's really just a swap of 7ths. Ravens, they were tight salary cap-wise coming into today, so they didn't have too many levers that they could pull, but they could trade draft picks. We knew that because they could have double-digit draft picks going into next year between the draft picks that they already have and the compensatory picks. So you were just kind of hoping that they would maybe use one of their more premier assets in order to get somebody. But when you're swapping 7th-round picks, you're going to get what you pay for the most part. You're not going to get somebody who is going to be an impact player. And for somebody who has been a healthy scratch for the last several weeks, you do wonder if his agent, who has been searching for a better situation, was able to find a better situation in Baltimore, because Jalen Armour-Davis is sort of on the fringes of the roster, and he's probably going to get elevations ahead of Tre'Davious White in the meantime, at least until they get Tre'Davious White up to speed. And then after that, Jalen Armour-Davis might just be a better player at this point in his career. I mean, Tre'Davious White, for several years in Buffalo, was a tremendous cornerback, but the injuries, the ACL tear in 2021 caused him to miss time that season and 2022. Achilles tear, October of last year. The 1-year, $10 million deal that he signed with the Rams was betting on his upside. It was laden with incentives, and he couldn't make the most out of it. And you mentioned the lack of versatility. That's another concern. You would at least like to have somebody who is going to be on the fringes of your roster, on your game day roster. You'd like to have somebody who can play inside, who can play slot corner, and maybe somebody who can bounce back to safety with all the trouble you've had with Marcus Williams this year. So he is really strictly an outside corner, can't really play inside, can't really play safety. And even then, he might be lower on the depth chart than Jalen Armour-Davis. So this is not somebody that I think Ravens fans should expect to come in here and push any of the guys above him. He's a nice depth piece, and if Marlon Humphrey has to miss more time, although he did play last week on a pitch count, or if somebody else goes down, you at least feel a little bit better about having somebody who has experience in the building. But to me, this is not a move that will move the needle an inordinate amount for this defense that is 32nd, dead last in the NFL in pass yards allowed.
Yeah, and they, according to Tom Pelissero of NFL Network, they were in the mix for Marshawn Lattimore, who obviously ended up going to the Commanders for a deal that was a little bit too rich for my liking. What was it? A day 3 pick, right? The Saints sent Lattimore and a 5th to the Commanders for a 3rd, a 4th, and a 6th-round pick. He's been good when he's been on the field. Minus 12.3 completion percentage over expected, according to Next Gen Stats. When targeted as the nearest defender of the season, the 3rd lowest among the 75 outside cornerbacks. But he's been a guy who hasn't been. He's been more reliable than Trey White, but not by a whole lot. So there is not really. It seems like a robust market for top of the line, starting level cornerbacks on sellers. So we all expected the Ravens to, be in the market for pass rush, whether it was an interior guy, edge rush guy. I still think Calais Campbell would have made a lot of sense. And maybe, he at a certain point becomes available on the, free agency market. Maybe he just says, hey, Miami, I would like you guys to release me. You don't have to pay me for these final 5 games. But the problem with that is that if the Ravens keep on winning, they are going to be very, very low on that waiver claim totem pole, and the chances of him falling to the Ravens, considering what he can bring, or what anybody who could be a needle mover and is released in a couple weeks' time, seems like it's pretty slim. But who knows? Yeah. Maybe if the Ravens keep dropping a couple stinkers, then things could break their way. But at that point, maybe the defense will just be in such disarray that it doesn't matter if you get Calais Campbell or Myles Garrett or Max Crosby, or who knows.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the Dolphins still think they're have an outside shot at making the playoffs because they have Tua healthy again. I know they only have 2 wins, but there's a reason to believe that they could improve over the second half and maybe have a run that the Bills did last year and sneak into the playoffs. So maybe they didn't have Calais Campbell on the trade market at all and they wanted to keep him in-house. But there were other guys that were dealt. I mean, the Steelers grabbed edge rusher Preston Smith for a 7th round pick. So another kind of day 3 late addition that is not going to add a whole lot. There were guys that were dealt earlier this week. I mean, guys that was dealt today. Zadarius Smith, your favorite of the guys that were seemingly available. Browns dealt him and a 7th to Detroit for a 5th and a 6th. So again, day 3 swaps. These are moves that the Ravens could have made. We don't know everything that was out there. The Steelers also added a wide receiver. They got Mike Williams from the Jets for a 5th round pick. So there were players on the move here. And in a year where Lamar Jackson is playing the best football of his career, he's the favorite to win back-to-back MVPs. This offense is humming. They just added Deontay Johnson last week for a day 3 pick. You would like to have seen the Ravens push more chips to the center of the table in order to win this year, in order to get over the hump, because you're only going to have so many bites of the apple when Lamar Jackson is playing this well, when he's got a Hall of Fame running back in Derrick Henry, when you're able to pay the guys that you have in-house. This felt like the time to push more chips to the center of the table. We know that Eric DeCosta is not exactly conservative, but he is always cautious to trade assets such as a 1st round pick. I wasn't expecting that, but maybe a day 2 pick, maybe a 2nd or 3rd rounder could have been on the table. When the right guy is available, like Roquan Smith, EDC will make that move. He must not have thought that there was anybody who was worth a 2nd or 3rd round pick today.
Yeah, and if you want to be critical of EDC, you could say, just look at what has become of this draft class after the top 2 picks. And, not to say that a Devontae Walker or TJ Tampa or a Nick Samac or a Sanusi Kane can't be contributors, if not outright starters over the next couple of years. But outside of Nate Wiggins and Roger Rosengarten, I mean, the Ravens have gotten very, very little out of this draft class in year 1. And you could say, well, what are the odds realistically that you're going to get, player, draft pick 4 to draft pick 11? Because, obviously they're projected to have 11 picks in next year's class. What are the chances that those guys are going to meaningfully, help in next year's Super Bowl chase at a level or 2 above what you could have gotten, for a slight overpay on this year's trade market? So I understand that the key to building around Lamar and the key to, building around some of these big money contracts that are coming down the pipeline is to have that draft capital, is to fill this roster with a lot of guys on a lot of cheap contracts. But, you just look at some of the stats for this pass rush and you can't help but shake your head and wonder why the Ravens couldn't have, gotten this across the finish line. I mean, since week 5, they are, bottom 10 in pressure rate. They're bottom 10 in average time to pressure. They faced some, absolute tomato cans of offensive lines in that stretch and still weren't able to really do anything. And, if this gets to a point on Thursday night where Joe Burrow is just picking the Ravens apart, piece by piece, because he's either getting the ball out quickly because there's not really a whole lot of quick pressure generators on this team, or because he has time to go through every single progression in his read, kind of like Bo Nix was able to, because again, no one can get, long pressures on him either. And the Ravens end up losing that game and end up further back of the Steelers in the AFC North race. Then it's going to be a very unpleasant, final 2 months for Eric DeCosta, because I don't think, I just don't know how much realistically you can expect this pass rush to improve, considering that they've enjoyed pretty good health for the most part.
Yeah, and there's not a whole lot of reason for internal improvement, like you said, because maybe Zach Orr is going to get better as a first-year defensive coordinator, and he'll figure some stuff out like Mike McDonald did in his first year as defensive coordinator. But it's not like they're getting somebody big who's coming off injured reserve midway through the season. It's not like they're getting for example, a Keaton Mitchell to go out and help the run game. There's nobody who's going to come in here and suddenly change the tone of your defense in a way that maybe a trade could have. You also mentioned the struggles that they've had from those mid-round picks from this past year. Those are 3 spots in Adisa Isaac, Devontae Walker, TJ Tampa after they took Wiggins and Rosengarten. Isaac Walker in Tampa, edge rusher, wide receiver, cornerback. Those are 3 spots that we thought the Ravens could have traded for. They did add Deontay Johnson, wide receiver, so they were clearly showing that they weren't thrilled about, and they shouldn't be thrilled about what they've gotten from Devontae Walker so far because it's been absolutely nada this season. And edge rusher, that's the spot we thought the Ravens could have added at the trade deadline. Adisa Isaac has been a non-factor. TJ Tampa in the secondary has also been a non-factor. Injuries have certainly played a part for both of those guys, but the mid-round picks have not been showing up, and that's part of the reason that the Ravens have been struggled so much on defense this year. So underwhelmed is our word of the day because that's kind of how we feel at this point as we look ahead to Thursday's game against the Cincinnati Bengals. And Jonas, let's preview that game because if this feels familiar, it's because not only did these teams meet 5 weeks ago back in week 5 when the Ravens won an absolute thriller, perhaps the best game of the NFL season so far, 41-38. But they also met on Thursday Night Football a year ago, last November, when the Ravens and the Bengals met at M&T Bank Stadium, and it ended in a Ravens win, but it cost the Bengals Joe Burrow, and it cost the Ravens Mark Andrews. So this is a very familiar feeling heading into Thursday's game, and the Ravens are favored by 6 right now. Over-under is 53 points, by far the highest in Week 10. Are we in for another shootout here, Jonas, especially after the Ravens didn't add anything to their defense?
I am done trying to apply logic and reason to these AFC North games. It is not made any sense at all. And by the way, it looks like, according to the Ravens, that they did just confirm the trade with Tre'Davious White. So it has been processed, and I don't think we'll see Trey on Thursday night because that would be very, very unrealistic. But this is going to be a fun game. I think probably the 2 best quarterbacks in the league right now. Maybe throw Jaden Daniels and I guess Patrick Mahomes in the mix there, but Lamar and Joe Burrow are 1-2 in PFF grade, and it's the trend lines for the Ravens are pretty good. They are almost unbeatable at home on prime time. I don't think they've lost a game under John Harbaugh on Thursday night. In Baltimore. The Paul Denner of The Athletic, who covers the Bengals for The Athletic, AFC North teams in divisional road primetime games are 2-11 since 2019. Road AFC North teams have lost 7 straight in the Thursday night slot dating back to October 2015. So there's a lot to feel good about if you're the Ravens, even with that secondary. And I still think that based on how things have progressed injury-wise for Cincinnati and the Ravens, that's probably even more reason to be encouraged if you're a Ravens fan.
Let's talk injuries. Lamar Jackson, another day not on the practice field. Another week, another day where we're talking about Lamar Jackson not out there. But Jonas, we saw him miss 2 days last week. He was out with rest, according to John Harbaugh, but then was listed on the practice report, knee injury. But if the formula is to get him off his feet and allow him to, recuperate more and keep his body healthy for the stretch run, it certainly worked last week because they absolutely blew the doors off the Denver Broncos. What do you think about his injury status for this week, and do you expect him to follow a similar script that he did last week?
Sorry, I was just trying to get caught up on Bengals practice news. You're asking about Lamar?
I am.
Yeah, Harbaugh said he'll play Thursday, so I guess he's playing Thursday. We saw him in the locker room about an hour ago. Seemed to be walking around fine. It was interesting to listen to the Sean Payton presser from Monday with their local media, and he said that they did some research before the game against the Ravens, and I guess unsurprisingly determined or prognosticated that they would see fewer design runs from Lamar because he just hadn't really put himself in harm's way that way, when he was coming back from a limited week of practice. So I guess that did bear itself out. I know we talked about how
it didn't help them at all that
Spry,
they had that
no,
knowledge.
definitely not. And Lamar, I think could have definitely been more involved in the design run game because he still looked elusive as all hell when he was breaking the pocket, bouncing away from guys who were bearing down on him. So I guess maybe we'll get a better barometer for where he is health wise by how many times he is involved in the option game. Some of the counter bash stuff, some of the design QB stuff. We'll see, but I just think that this was a kind of weird situation for Lamar and the Ravens this past 5-day stretch, 6-day stretch where Lamar was obviously not at 100%, but then again, who in the NFL is at this point in the season and having to deal with a game against a good Broncos defense and then turn around 5 days later, play an AFC North hard-hitting rival in Cincinnati. So whatever the Ravens felt like they had to do to get Lamar ready, they are clearly the experts. They have millions of dollars invested in, sports science. We don't have any invested in it. We just kind of read our palms and try to make sense of what the hell is happening. So if they say Lamar is good to go on Thursday, who are we to argue?
And on the other side, T. Higgins missed the last game for the Cincinnati Bengals against the Las Vegas Raiders. Imagine losing to that Raiders team. He, last time these two teams played, had 9 catches for 83 yards and 2 touchdowns in a game where all of the Bengals offensive stats looked good. So if he is not in this offense, they will certainly feel it. But he also didn't play in the last 2 games. So the loss against the Eagles, the win over the Raiders. And he was estimated to have missed practice on Monday. So if he's not in that offense, they'll certainly feel it. And Orlando Brown Jr., the left tackle, our old friend, missed that game too, the win over the Raiders. So these are 2 big pieces of this offense that will certainly be needed for Cincinnati. And then you factor in Zach Moss, who's out indefinitely, and Eric All, who suffered a torn ACL tight end against the Raiders. And this offense could look a little bit different than the last time these 2 teams met.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously Higgins and Orlando are the 2 big ticket items there. Digging into some of the numbers for the T. Higgins effect, it's pretty extraordinary. I like. It's not like the Ravens aren't used to this injury uncertainty with T. Higgins, and just looking at some of the Broncos, or excuse me, the Bengals reporters' tweets, maybe they haven't had practice yet, or maybe it's a close practice because I haven't seen anything about his availability. I think we'll probably get the injury report relatively soon for what those guys have been doing. But when T. Higgins and Jamar Chase have been on the field together against the Ravens, Higgins has had a combined 41 catches for 497 yards and 6 touchdowns. He obviously went for 83 yards and 2 scores in week 5 against the Ravens. But when Higgins and Chase have been on the field, the Bengals have averaged 6.8 yards per play, which would rank among the league's best rates this year. 8.6 yards per pass attempt, which is, Lamar level good. 0.28 EPA per dropback, MVP level good. 69% accuracy, 17.6% explosive pass play rate, 5.1% sack rate. All really, really good. When it's just been Jamar Chase on the field, 4.9 yards per play, among the league's lowest rates this year. 6 yards per attempt, also very, very low. Minus 0.06 EPA per dropback, so worse than average. His accuracy has fallen about 5 points. The explosive pass play rate has been basically in half to 9.1%, and the sack rate has almost doubled to 8.6%. So you are talking about a dramatically different offense for Cincinnati when T. Higgins has not been on the field, which is not surprising. I asked John Harbaugh about just kind of how the shape of this Bengals passing attack changes when he's not out there, and he said he feels like T. Higgins is one of the NFL's best receivers. So it's something to consider, just not for this game, but also what the hell Cincinnati decides to do with Higgins long term, because you could argue that this year, even with the injuries and stuff kind of getting in the way, he's proven himself worthy of doing whatever it takes to kind of lock him down and just have that troika of Burrow, Chase, and Higgins for the long term, because it's clearly, if it's given the Ravens and their defense, which has been excellent until this year, as many problems as they have, why wouldn't you just try to keep that group locked up for as long as you can?
Yeah, I mean, having two superstar wide receivers can make all the difference for your offense. And we've seen this year just how much the Ravens offense has benefited from the reemergence of Rashad Bateman, just how much of a step he has taken forward. And in turn, this offense has taken a massive step forward because of it. Well, if T. Higgins plays or not, the Ravens defense will still be under a lot of pressure to perform on Thursday night. And Marlon Humphrey, who was on that pitch count last week, finally talked to the media. What did you glean from Marlon Humphrey, your guy who had a key critical interception the last time these two teams met? He got a pick in the fourth quarter that allowed the Ravens to tie the game in regulation before they went on to win in overtime. What did he say to the media today?
He talked yesterday, but he went to bat for Zach Orr, just saying that he's obviously not as online as he once was. He doesn't have Twitter during the season. I think all he does on Instagram is Instagram Live, or so he says. So he's basically saying, like, when things have gone bad, it's been us. It's been one guy, being in the wrong place at the right time, not holding his technique the right way, and he feels like more often than not, just a disproportionate amount of disasters have happened. In ways that in previous seasons or maybe with other teams, they haven't been punished in that kind of way. So obviously, you look at where the Ravens have been. You talk about them being down at the bottom of the pass defense leaderboard. I don't know how credible a defense that is because of just how bad they have been against good passing attacks, bad passing attacks. But at least, from a guy who is as public facing as Marlon and whose word, carries a lot of weight inside the locker room and definitely outside the locker room, to see him, step up in Zach Orr's defense can't hurt. The last thing that this defense needs is some infighting. So I guess the vibes with that aren't as bad as maybe they would seem to be, considering everything that's happened with Marcus Williams and Eddie Jackson and just the general tenor of things for that defense. But it's another big test on Thursday, and if Joe Burrow lights them up for 350, 400 yards, 5 touchdowns, then I would imagine that there will be some finger pointing.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly gave Zach Orr a grace period at the start of the season. First time NFL defensive coordinator. He's got a lot on his shoulders, having to build up a defense that lost a lot of pieces in the offseason. Huge shoes to fill, taking over for a guy who just got hired as a head coach in Seattle in Mike McDonald. So a lot on his plate this season. But we're reaching now the point of the season, week 10, where you would like to see some meaningful steps forward. It's not like the Ravens have to shut out the Bengals on Thursday, but they can't allow what happened 5 weeks ago to happen again when you had T. Higgins and Jamar Chase combined for almost 300 yards. You can't have Joe Burrow be 30 for 39 and absolutely every throw he makes is an easy one. So there need to be improvements, and it has to start, I think, on Thursday. On the other side of the ball, though, this is a Bengals defense that struggled against the Ravens 5 weeks ago and has struggled against good offenses all season long. 38 points allowed to the Washington Commanders, 24 to Carolina, who is absolutely horrific offensively. So to allow 24 points to that Panthers team is an embarrassment, I think. 41 to the Ravens, of course, and 37 to the Philadelphia Eagles. And last time these two teams met, Lamar went 26 for 42 for 348 yards, 4 touchdowns, no picks. Zay Flowers had 111 receiving yards on 7 catches. Bateman had a touchdown. Isaiah Likely had 2 touchdowns. Derrick Henry had a great game stat-wise, 92 rushing yards on 15 carries, but the bulk of that came from one massive run in overtime. So the Ravens were really airing it out. They went with a pass-heavy attack. Do you expect that to be the same game plan here on Thursday, Jonas?
It's going to be interesting. I think the big question mark for Cincinnati on the defensive side is BJ Hill. He's been their best interior defensive lineman, has been a good pass rusher, has been a good run stuffer. I think they've been markedly better when he's been on the field than when he's been sidelined. He's dealing with a ribs injury. I think Zach Taylor said yesterday that the prognosis was better than expected, but I'm not sure if that means for the long term or potentially getting back on Thursday. I can't imagine how painful it would be to play in the trenches with a rib injury, especially when guys are literally aiming for your ribs on some of those double teams and those down blocks. That would be a very, very painful experience. Going back and watching some of the tape from that Week 5 game, you couldn't really hold too much against Derrick Henry for that relatively quiet first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, because it seems like every time Lamar was handing it off to him, Cincinnati was dropping that safety into the box and basically daring Lamar to beat them through the air. And it was surprising because I think Cincinnati's run defense coming into that game was not especially highly regarded, but looking at some of the advanced stats, like they actually, had the best, or they still have the best average yards before contact against Derrick Henry of any defense that the Ravens have faced. And I know that they are not a good run defense. They're 23rd against run, 20th against the pass, obviously. But I would expect the Ravens to have a lot more success in terms of creating open running lanes for Derrick Henry. I guess you could say that if Lamar's hurt, then maybe that kind of cancels out some of the effect of just the average progression of this offense having a better game against a defensive line that could be without its top run stuffer. But we'll see. I just think that even though Cincinnati is going to have Mike Hilton back in the slot, a really important piece for them, does a lot for them in pass coverage, does a lot for them as the run defenders. They kind of blue collar, stick his nose in there kind of player. At what spot do the Ravens not really have an advantage? I mean, even Trey Hendrickson, coming off an incredible game, four tackles, all sacks against the Raiders. He's going to have to deal with Ronnie Stanley. He's going to have to deal with, chip blocks from Pat Ricard and Isaiah Likely and Mark Andrews and Charlie Kohler. So even if you could say that is a realistic advantage for Cincinnati's defense, it's still going to be marginalized because of who the Ravens have blocking him on the right side of that Bengals line.
Well, Jonas, today is election day. There's less than 3 hours until the final buzzer sounds. I wish there was a big buzzer that they sounded at polling places all across the country at 8 o'clock. So there's less than 3 hours for you to vote if you're on the East Coast, which if you haven't yet, go out and vote. Absolutely do your citizen's duty and cast your ballot because you can't complain if you don't vote. But Jonas, I'm going to make you do your least favorite thing here, which is explain a game because you have an idea for us, a topic of conversation here. Why don't you explain what you've cooked up for us today?
Our neighbors to the north in Pennsylvania have been the subject of much scrutiny. Pennsylvania is seen as the swing state vote for this election. So my question to you, Paul, who is the 2024 Pennsylvania electoral factor of this game? What's the matchup? What's the player, the decision that's going to swing things in this game? That is admittedly not really a coin toss in the same way that this election seems to be. Obviously the Ravens being favored by 6 means that the implied odds are heavily in their favor. But who's the keystone state of this Week 10 game for Thursday Night Football?
Yeah. Who's my Bucks County, Pennsylvania here? I'm going to go with Roquan Smith because at some point he has to get going, whether it's in coverage or rushing the passer. We've seen him used a lot the last few weeks rushing the passer, and it's just not been effective. I mean, he's had 3 tackles on Sunday, which was his lowest total of the season, even though he still leads this team in tackles. He has just 1 tackle for loss this season. He had 5 last year. He does not have a quarterback hit this year. He had 5 last year. He does not have a sack this year. He has not had a season in his NFL career where he's had fewer than a sack and a half in 7 seasons. So he has to get going one way or the other. And it's not like he's being used so much in coverage that he's not coming downhill. He's just not beating his guys when he's given an assignment to rush the passer. So whether it's getting his first sack of the season, whether it's picking off a pass, there was a play where I was rewatching the highlights, the 20-minute highlights from the Week 5 game where he was just a step slow, where the Bengals were running double slants with T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, and he just didn't get there in time. And that's the kind of play that he would make so often last season. So it is unfathomable for me that he would take that much of a step back. I mean, 10 months ago, he was perhaps the best off-ball linebacker in the NFL, except for maybe Fred Warner. How he has regressed this season under Zach Orr has been baffling to me. And I can't imagine it continuing for the entire season because that can only be an excuse for so long. Losing Patrick Queen next to him can only be an excuse for so long. He is my Pennsylvania in this because he's got to make a game-changing play. He did it all the time last year. I think of the Dolphins game where he makes that pick over the middle, just makes a play that few off-ball linebackers can make in the NFL, reads Tua perfectly. That kind of play has to show up on Sunday because what changed the tenor of the game 5 weeks ago? It was the Marlon Humphrey pick because the Bengals were coming up and down the field, and it wasn't until they forced a turnover that the Ravens defense was able to make a stand. That play needs to come from Roquan Smith this week.
Yeah, you need a palate cleanser. You need something to change the optics. I know Marcus Williams got dunked on literally and then probably figuratively online for the Bo Nix touchdown, but that's a tough assignment. He ditched his running back to go cover the quarterback that no one really expected to be running a route on a friggin' 4th down goal line play, and I think more people, because of the result for the Ravens, because they won as handily as they did, and the defense had the kind of solid performance that it did, are more inclined to, remember the early 4th down or the early 1st down tackle they had in that game that kind of set the tone for the defense than they do the touchdown and coverage. And I think Roquan probably needs a splashy play like that, whether it's a sack or an interception or a punch out to get people back on his side, because the more that this defense struggles and the more that they have communication breakdowns and the more that they realize that Roquan is the guy wearing the green dot and getting paid all these millions of dollars, it's going to be tough for him to win the popular vote, so to speak. So my Pennsylvania is Brandon Stevens, I guess specifically his matchup against Jamar Chase. If you remember this same matchup on Thursday Night Football last year, Brandon Stevens, I don't think allowed a single catch until that kind of window dressing touchdown to Jamar Chase pretty late in the game. The Ravens were happy to kind of leave him alone, obviously with a lot of safety help over the top, and just say, Brandon, go lock down one of the NFL's best wide receivers. And he went out and did it. And now he's having maybe the roughest stretch of his career as a starting cornerback. We talked about just kind of how far he's fallen down the PFF rankings. So I think he needs a bounce back. And obviously, if you are not very charitable, you can be saying that the Trey White trade is a bit of an insurance policy to the insurance policy for Brandon Stevens. I still think he can be a really useful player for this Ravens defense. But if he gets toasted again and it's Jamar Chase and maybe it's D. Higgins and maybe it's Andre Yoshavas who are going up against him and just cooking him for explosive plays, then the Ravens are going to have to figure out exactly what to do, because the last thing that Brandon Stevens needs is his confidence shattered before a game against Russell Wilson and George Pickens and now I guess Mike Williams, because the one thing that we know that they're going to be doing is just throwing a lot of back shoulder fades or deep balls, and Brandon Stevens has struggled to turn his head to the ball and make plays on the ball, even when he's a yard or so separated from the guy who's actually being targeted. And you just want to see Brandon Stevens and all the good work that he's done for this defense last year, this year in practice, be rewarded with a game where he's actually he kind of shows his shutdown potential. And we just haven't really seen a whole lot of that, especially recently.
So, Jonas, what is your prediction for tonight? I mean, what is your prediction for Thursday?
I've got Donald. No. Kamala. No. I've got the Ravens. 31. Bengals 24. I think it's, like I said, it's really tough to forecast exactly what could happen, especially because, again, the Lamar weirdness of him not practicing doesn't really fill you with a whole lot of warm and fuzzies about just where he is physically, even though we just saw him go off and throw for a perfect passer rating against one of the NFL's best secondaries. But weird stuff happens in these divisional games, and I think even if Lamar takes a step back, I still think that the running game will take a step forward with Derrick Henry. It'll at least be better than it was in Week 5. I think that if T. Higgins can't go, or if he's limited in a crucial way, then that'll definitely help the Ravens, just kind of limit some of those explosives that really doom them for so much of that game in Week 5. We know it's tough to win in Baltimore. We know it's tough to win in primetime against Baltimore. I just think that the injuries that have kind of done a number on this Bengals defense are going to be too much for them to overcome what is, a really, really good, if still flawed Ravens team, especially coming out of the trade deadline.
Yeah, it will probably come down to who's healthy for this Bengals team, but I also have the Ravens winning this one by a closer margin, 30-28. As everybody who has watched the Ravens play this season, watched the Bengals play this season, I'm expecting a high-scoring game, and I expect that it could come down to the wire, because last year, I mean, that was a game that ended in a blowout only because Joe Burrow went down with injury as early as he did in that game. So that was a game that could have been a whole lot closer. And last week's game against the Broncos could have been a whole lot closer had Bo Nix not been absolute garbanzo beans. Yeah, so I've got the Ravens winning this one as well. But Jonas, we will have complete coverage as we get ready for that game on Thursday night. Please like, rate, review, subscribe, all that good stuff. Write us a good review on Apple Podcasts of the Banner Ravens podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. At Jonas_Shaffer is his handle. At Paul Mancano. And of course, you got to subscribe to the Baltimore Banner. $1 for 6 months if you haven't already. It's the best place to get all of Jonas's great coverage, Gianna Hahn, Kyle Goon, and so much more. For Jonas Shaffer,